I'm pleased to have on the line with me Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. His books, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution and Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, which examines the new Cold War, are both available in paperback. The website, thenation.com. You can tweet him at The Nation. Professor Cohen, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
It's always great. It's always an honor, actually, to have you with us. It's great to have you with us.
Well, I am not the bearer of glad tidings today.
Okay, well, let's get right into it. What tidings are you bearing?
Let me give you three extended factual headlines that are not being reported or discussed by the mainstream American press, and then you go where you want to go, okay?
Sounds like a plan.
Headline one, there's a lot of talk in this country in the last 2 years about what's the number one existential security threat in the world. And for reasons completely unfactual and irrational, the Obama administration, and particularly its generals in Washington and in Brussels, the headquarters of NATO, have said that Russia, Putin's Russia as they call it, is the number one existential threat. This is false. This is an impeachable falsehood. The number one existential threat in the world is international terrorism. And we wake up every day and turn on our radios or our TV sets or open our newspapers, and we see the truth of that. Whether we read a headline about Syria, Iraq, and Libya, the Islamic State, we read about the blowing up of an airport in Istanbul, whether we read about an attack on Paris and Brussels, or we read about acts of terrorism in the United States, though we can argue how much that's related to the other episodes. But without any doubt, Tom, and I speak not only for myself, but for people who are in positions of much greater eminence than I am, including a couple of sitting governors, at least 2 or 3 senators, a number of members of the House of Representatives. It's international terrorism that's the number one threat. And you got to couple it with the reality that these now very well organized groups, because terrorism is now a state, at least an embryonic state, this is new, the Islamic State, with its main headquarters in 3 capitals really, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. That this is a new phenomenon, that these people are in search of, at a minimum, radioactive material. So this has got to be linked with nuclear proliferation and the protection of nuclear reactive material, which is attainable by theft or finance in many places of the world.
Well, in a lot of these towns that ISIS has seized have hospitals that have stores of radioactive material used for radiomedicine, and that could be used to make dirty bombs. I mean, they've probably already got this stuff.
The French police were very worried when they began to investigate the Paris bombings that they did have it. But if they have it, you would think they would have used it, or they're preparing to use it. Or
they haven't been able to get it out of these countries because we're detecting it at borders and airports.
Tom, our ports are completely unprotected. Focused on airports. But what about our ports? I mean, I want to make the other 2 points, but let's dramatize that one.
Yep.
Imagine that on September 11th, 2001, the 2 planes that crashed into the World Trade Center towers, causing an inferno, had radioactive material aboard. Right. To this day today, in Manhattan, where I live, that entire area and wherever that radioactive air was blown would not be inhabitable. It would be radioactive. So, number one existential threat, international terrorism, and the very well-funded, very well-organized attempts by these groups to get radioactive material, not a nuclear weapon, unless it was a suitcase weapon, because they have no way of delivering it. They need material to put in a bomb, to explode in an airport, a subway, a building. So this is beyond a doubt the number one existential threat. Number two, we need We must have, and very soon, a full alliance with Russia against international terrorism for one reason. Of all the states in the world, and don't think about, forget Putin, and forget Assad and all this focus on personalities. Russia is the number one capable terror-fighting state in the world. They have more capacity. They've been in the Middle East for centuries. They have more Arabic-speaking intelligence officers than we have French-speaking ones. We have very few Arabic-speaking intelligence officers. They have informers embedded in terrorist organizations. They have decades of experience fighting terrorism at home. They know what they're doing. Remember, just as an illustration, that the United States was warned about the Tsarnaev brothers who blew Boston 3 years ago. They were warned by Russian intelligence, and the warnings were disregarded.
Well, we were warned about 9/11 by Russian intelligence, were we not?
That I do not know.
Okay.
There have been rumors, but we know for a fact that Russian intelligence told the FBI in Moscow and in Washington, and the CIA, which has a bureau in Moscow, and in the United States, about the older Tsarnaev brother. That he was in Dagestan, which is a part of the Russian Federation, hanging out with known jihadists. He was there to learn something, possibly to do something. So Russia's capacity, and we can talk about this, to fight terrorism is far greater than our own, whether we're talking about what they've done in Syria or whether we're talking about their intelligence. Third point, instead of embracing Russia as a partner in the fight against terrorism, the White House and the Pentagon and the mainstream media have declared Russia to be an enemy in this new Cold War we've launched. And I will give you an illustration. If you flicked on your TV sets to cable talk political news, where people who think about policy seem to go, it doesn't matter whether you went to MSNBC, CNN, or Fox, and you had hours of discussion about the terrorist attack a few days ago on Ataturk Airport in Istanbul, you did not hear the word Russia mentioned, not even mentioned, except to denigrate Russia. All the talk is, well, what does Mrs. Clinton say we're going to do, and what does Trump say, and what should the United States do?
Well, and now there's all this hysteria around the three guys were all Russian-speaking, and one of them was ethnically Russian.
That's completely bogus. I mean, the point of it is that two of the guys were from Central Asia, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. And a lot of people in that area speak Russian because they were a part of the Soviet Union. Right. The third guy was from Dagestan, which is inside the Russian Federation, which, like Chechnya, for example, is part of the Russian Caucasus. He was carrying a Russian passport. Of course he was carrying a Russian passport. He's from the Russian Caucasus. All that tells you is that the current front, or let me put it differently, the current citadels of international terrorism are Syria, Iraq, and Libya. To a certain extent, Afghanistan, which we've created, but it is spreading now to Central Asia, the former part of the Soviet Union. So I think there was a Kyrgyz and an Uzbek guy and a guy from Dagestan, from the Russian Caucasus. But of course they speak Russian. I mean, they grew up bilingual, undoubtedly. Probably speak Kyrgyz and Russian, just like in Dagestan. They will speak a local Caucasus dialect as well as Russian. Right. The point is geographic and geopolitical. And we have excluded Russia from this struggle.
Right. We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. His books, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution and Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, are both available in paperback. We'll be right back with more of Professor Stephen Cohen.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
You can read his writings at thenation.com, thenation.com, and you can tweet him at thenation. And welcome back. So, Professor Cohen, your three headlines all seem to have a common thread, which is that we are ignoring the possible benefits of a relationship with Russia, and for reasons unspecified, we seem to be amping up the a new Cold War with Russia.
Well, I gotta formulate that differently. We've been in a Cold War with Russia for a decade.
Right.
We're amping it up in the sense that NATO is building up on Russia's Baltic and Black Sea borders, risking war there. So it's well amped. I guess you're right in saying it's amped up. I'd also put it differently. I would say that it is absolutely necessary to have this alliance against terrorism with Russia. I remind you that after the attack on Paris, President Hollande of France called for, and I quote him, a grand coalition, including Russia, against international terrorism. And it was rejected by the White House, which was busy announcing that Russia was the #1 existential enemy. Now, the sub-point is that our utterly degraded mainstream media, which have become worse on international affairs in my lifetime by the decade, have completely blacklisted, deleted, boycotted, erased these realities. When you see a panel on these shows about international terrorism, there is not a single person there who either understands the importance of Russia or actually understands Russia or knows anything about it. These are bogus experts. And the reason is, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and official Washington, these networks are locked into a narrative. Terrorism, bad. Putin's Russia, even worse. But let's do some news that broke today. There's a report by Josh Rogan in the Washington Post on its website today saying that Obama has reached out to Russia for some kind of partial alliance in Syria against the Islamic State, which the Obama administration has mainly refused, even though the Russians have been practically begging for it since they began their air war against the Islamic State there in September of last year. You'll remember, I don't remember if we discussed it on your program, we might have, that 2 or 3 weeks ago, 51 so-called diplomats at the State Department, I don't know why they're not the Department of Defense, published a memo demanding that Obama attack Assad's army in Syria, which has long been the neocon liberal interventionist agenda, to get rid of Assad. But to attack Assad's army is to attack Russia, because Russia is Assad's ally in Syria. So today we get a report. It has to be verified, but I assume since it was leaked to the Washington Post, it was verified and has a purpose, that Obama is thinking about an alliance, a partial alliance with Russia, sharing of intelligence. There are certain conditions. What's interesting about this article, Tom, and you know how to read the American press as well as I do, is that it is a completely unbalanced article. It's not news report. It's really saying this is happening by Obama, and it must be stopped. And Ash Carter, Obama's own Secretary of Defense, says he's against it.
Oh my, oh my. We'll continue this in just a moment. We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen. We'll be right back. It's 20 minutes past. Welcome back. 20 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton, the author of Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution and Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, both available now in paperback. You can read his writings at thenation.com. You can tweet him at TheNation. Professor Cohen, you were just referencing a piece in today's Washington Post about a possible that President Obama might be reaching out to the Russians for some sort of collaborative alliance with Syria. I want to reset that so that you can talk about that. And then I just wanted to toss two quick questions out and then just kind of let you run with the rest of the segment. To a large extent, there are many scholars who are suggesting that you said, terrorism is the biggest existential threat, that much of this terrorism is actually being fueled by climate change, that over 1 million Syrian farmers had to leave their farms because they turned into desert and ended up in the cities in Syria, that this is happening across northern Africa. What role does that have in any of this, number one? And number two, you're talking about the failure of the mainstream press. Your wife, Katrina vanden Heuvel, publishes The Nation. I'm wondering about the alternative press. Is The Nation covering this? I'm assuming you all are. And are there other press outlets out there that are doing a more reasonable job? Let me just, with all that, now toss it to you.
All right, let's go back to the Washington Post report.
Okay.
Clearly, it's not meant to be a news report, because if it was, it would say Obama's considering a partial alliance with Russia and Syria. Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, is against it. They do have that. But the rest of the article is only people who are against it. In a real news report, they would say, look, these folks are against it, but some folks are for it. And here's what they say. They completely delete the people who might be urging Obama to do this. We also have reasonably informed report that Obama has become very worried about his foreign policy legacy, as he may well do, and that he's beginning to think, the way Reagan did at the end of his term, when he reached out to Gorbachev, that Obama's is thinking now the possibility of a rapprochement with Russia. If so, Syria would be the logical place to begin. But you can see from this report the fierce opposition, if this is true about Obama, to the president within his own administration.
Wow.
So that needs to be watched every day. And though I am not a great admirer of Obama as a foreign policy leader, on the contrary, we need to support him. As for climate change, with all deference, and I'm not going to speak for my wife and how she runs The Nation, but she herself wrote in her own Washington Post web column, I think on Tuesday, about this issue of the need to have an alliance with Russia regarding nuclear weapons and terrorism. So, there are different voices at The Nation, but I have to say with all deference that the progressive community in America is terrible on this issue. They've fallen into the demonizing of Russia. They have made issues that are by any existential measurement secondary, number one. So, Tom, I know how you feel about climate change, but if these guys get a hold of radioactive material, it is going to be really bad for the climate.
Yeah.
You got to have priorities here.
Yeah.
If these guys get a hold of a small tactical nuclear weapon and blow it up in a large region, let me tell you something else that's on their mind. Do you know how many nuclear reactors there are in the world? We're told they're completely safe, that they can't be attacked. That's simply not true.
Right.
If they can blow a nuclear reactor, say at Chernobyl, that is like using a nuclear weapon.
Right. And one
that area is so. What are we talking about? Climate change in the area of Chernobyl today?
Right.
You can't even go into that area.
Yeah, you're
so
right.
We've got to have priorities, and the priority is international terrorism and its pursuit of radioactive material.
Well, I always thought it was fascinating that in the, I think it was in the 9/11 report, it might have just been in one of the news reports of the day back around 2002, 2003, that it came out that after Mohammed Atta was captured, maybe it was a little later than that, it came out that in the initial interrogation, he indicated that actually it wasn't Atta, he was dead, but he was the pilot, but the guy who set it up, I'm forgetting his name, that they first thought about flying one of those planes into the Indian Point reactor outside of New York City. And because there's this giant pool right next to the reactor, as there are with all the reactors, where there's all this spent fuel. And if they could just fly the plane into that, they didn't even have to hit the reactor dome. They'd fly the plane into the pool, and it would disperse all that radioactive material and render, 100 square mile area, including all of Manhattan, uninhabitable for centuries, perhaps thousands of years. And he didn't do it because he just assumed it was guarded by missiles. It's not. None of them are. I'm not, telling a secret to anybody. This is so. Anyway, what do you make of this?
No, you're right. You're 100% right. The jet fuel upon the crash would ignite the whole complex, sending the radioactive material into the air. I mean, we saw what happened at Chernobyl. I mean, depending on which way the wind is blowing that day, that stuff reached Scandinavia from Belarus. We are told that all these nuclear reactors cannot be attacked. It's not true. And let's say it's true in the United States. It's certainly not true in Ukraine. Many countries with weak infrastructures have nuclear reactors. And the one thing you have to say about these terrorists is they're not dummies. They have technological advisors. They have state capacities. What did somebody say about 9/11? Low technology, high concept.
Right.
They got a lot of concepts. But the point I want to make, Tom, is that our mainstream media, our political class, and our presidential candidates, with a possible exception of Trump, if you can figure out what he's saying at any given moment, are not making this a central issue. They're not even talking about it. So, I mean, when is the last time you can remember an American presidential campaign when we didn't at least talk about nuclear weapons?
Right.
Or there should be arms control. There's no talk about them at all.
Right.
Can I give you one small illustration?
We have just about 20 seconds left.
Right.
Not even that. I'm sorry.
Then I'll just tease you and say Russia does things at airports we don't do that is sensible.
Interesting. Okay. So we'll have to have you back very soon. Professor Stephen Cohen, thank you so much for being with us today. It's great talking with you. It's 28 minutes past the hour. We'll be back. And anything goes song.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.